So let me ask you a question as we start today. Have you ever been in a situation where everything seems to be going wrong? Anybody ever been in one of those situations before? It's like you try and you try and you try, but everything just seems to be going south. You don't know what's going on. It just all seems to be going the wrong way. And maybe it's not because of your irresponsibility. Maybe it's not anything in particular that you did. It's like you did everything right. Or at least you thought you did everything right. You thought you followed the way the Lord was leading or served the people you were around in a godly way. You just thought everything went right, but nothing still seemed to be working. Have we all been there before? I've been there many times. Gary's been there. The rest of you all got a perfect life and never been there, it looks like. Sometimes these things that when life isn't working out the way you want it to work and things just aren't going the way you want it to go, sometimes those things are out of your control. Like 2020. We had no control over the events of 2020. A pandemic comes, nobody expects something like that to happen. Was that on your wish list last year for New Year's? Nobody expected that, right? But it happened. It's totally out of your control. Or maybe the situation was a relationship that you had, a friendship or a romantic relationship. Maybe it was a marriage. And you worked on the relationship, you tried your hardest, but for whatever reason, it just didn't work out. Maybe it was in school or at work. You busted your tail making the best grades you could make, but still you didn't get that scholarship, or you didn't get into the college of your choice, or maybe you worked as hard as you could in your job and the promotion still hasn't come, or the financial rewards still haven't come for you. And sometimes we get in these cycles of life and you just can't dig yourself out. You try to do all the right things, but it just keeps piling up, and you just need some help. Maybe you've been in a situation where you needed some financial help, somebody to help bail you out. Or maybe it was emotional help. You just struggled so much in a certain situation that you were just down and you needed some counseling or some encouragement to help you get out of that situation. You know, we hear this mantra all the time that if you work hard and you have dedication, it's going to pay off for you. But sometimes you just need a hand to pull you up. Sometimes hard work and dedication just isn't enough. Like you have probably found, I have also found myself in situations like that on numerous times throughout my life. And sometimes they're things that they seem kind of small, they're not that big a deal, but they're a big deal to you. And maybe they're a big deal to your family. And sometimes they're huge issues and they have huge implications for you and your loved ones. Ruth finds herself in one of these predicaments in chapter 2. If you were here last week or if you followed online with us last week, you'll remember in chapter 1, Naomi and her husband Elimelech had went to the land of Moab, fleeing the land of Bethlehem. And then they get to Moab, which was, if you remember, a land of God's enemies. And they get there and everything goes wrong to the point that Naomi lost everything. Her husband died, her 2 sons died. All she was left with was 2 Moabite daughters-in-laws, and to have Moabite daughters-in-law was frowned upon. It was 10 years of some great tragedy that they dealt with. Ruth, as the chapter 1 closes, Ruth, she's trying to do all the right things. Naomi, if you'll remember, was bitter about all that had happened. She said, "Don't even call me Naomi anymore," which meant pleasant. "Call me Mara," which means bitter. But Ruth, she had done the right thing. Ultimately, at the end, as the chapter closes, we see Ruth choosing to love God and to love people. the thing that all of us strive for, the greatest command, as we read about earlier. And because she chooses the right way to love God, to love people, what is her reward? She ends up in an unknown land. She ends up without any family because she left them all, without any food, with very little resources to deal with. And that's where we find ourselves as we enter into chapter 2 of this story. This story is an amazing story. Follow along with me as we dig into this. Verse 1, now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Now you remember, Elimelech was Naomi's husband who had died. And the writer of Ruth makes it clear that Boaz was a member of the clan of Elimelech. And that's a very important part of the story that we'll see here in just a few moments. Because to be a member of the clan, to be a member of the family, there was responsibilities that went along with that in this culture. To be a member of the clan meant that if someone passed away, you had responsibilities to those who were left behind by that person who had passed away. And it also mentions in this passage, in this verse, that Boaz was a worthy man. Now, it could have been talking about him being worthy because he was wealthy. He was a landowner. Or maybe it's talking about him being worthy because he is an upstanding moral man. I think as we read the story, we're going to see that it's both. Because he is a wealthy landowner, but he is also an upstanding moral man that we'll see play out as we go through this story. Verse 2. And Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. Now, Naomi, she still seems to be a little despondent, maybe a little bitter about what's going on. Ruth comes and she's like, let me go and get us some food. Let's take care of our needs. And Naomi's like, go. Do what you got to do. Still seems to be a little bitter about what's happening. And Ruth says, let me go and glean among the fields. Now, whoever uses the word glean? I see no hands. Do we understand what the word glean means? Because I did not until I studied this passage. To glean in this culture was a very important part of this culture. It meant that the poor could go into the fields after the harvesters had been in, and the harvesters, as part of the law, would leave a little bit behind for the poor, so the poor could come and glean that and take the little that was left. So Ruth is telling Naomi, we're hungry, we're broke, just let me go get some crumbs. Let me go live off the leftovers with you. She's satisfied living off the leftovers to be faithful to Naomi. Remember, Ruth had left everything by her choice. She had left her family, she had left her land, and here she is finding herself in Bethlehem saying, I'm going to take care of you, Naomi. Let's live off the crumbs. Verse 3. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to part of the field belonging to Boaz. She just happened to show up in the right place at the right time. It's kind of a dramatic thing that the author of this tells us. She'd went to the fields and she just happens to show up in the field of Boaz at the right place at the right time. Boaz of the clan of Elimelech. Verse 4. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, And he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." What a coincidence. Boaz just happens to show up at the same place that Ruth is. They didn't know each other. And this story, at this point, begins to become a Hallmark movie. Who has sat with your wife, men, and watched a Hallmark movie? And as you're watching the story play out on the screen, where this man comes from the big city to this small town and just so happens to run into his soulmate. And things just seem to work perfectly together. And you look over at your wife and tears are streaming down her face. And you realize she believes this is how things happen. You read this story and you're like, things don't happen this way. Ruth shouldn't have just shown up at the right place at the right time. Boaz shouldn't just show up at the right place at the right time where their paths just cross. Things just don't happen that way in real life. Or do they? I look back at Christy and my story. I met Christy when I was really young. She might have been a little older. But we didn't really get to know each other very well until my mom persuades me to go to Dollywood to get a job. Christy just so happens to be the one who interviews me. And I just so happened to get the job because she was already in love with me. Maybe not so much. I get the job. I end up on Christy's team. And we get to know each other a little bit. And then I get promoted. And we get to know each other even better. And become very good friends. And then begin to date. And 24 years later, here we are. Things just kind of happened. What we're beginning to see in this story is that life isn't just happenstance. Things don't always just happen for the sake of happening. God is sovereign over everything. He is the ruler over all. Sure, there's some things in your life that are mundane and they're routine, but even in those things, God is using those routines and those things that we feel are mundane to mold us into the people that we are. This is not coincidence that Ruth happens to show up there and that Boaz happens to show up there. It's not coincidence, it's God's providence that they're at the same place at the same time. The story is an amazing picture of God's providence. Verse 5. Then Boaz said to his young man, who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" Now we read that verse, and what we're reading is that "whose young woman is this" is Hebrew for check her out. You see her? She's kind of cute. Whose family is she a part of? I want to get to know her a little bit better. Verse 6. And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers.' So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest." And then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter. Do not go glean in another field, or leave this one." It's a weird pickup line, right? "But keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Maybe not the best pickup line, but maybe in their culture, it was a really good pickup line because he was showing her favor that should not have been expected. She was a foreigner. Not only is she a foreigner, but He doesn't just let her go into the fields to glean. He also says, go up and get water when you're thirsty from what the men have drawn. That was not customary. For starters, men did not draw the water for women. It was the other way around. And on top of that, there was no way that an Israelite was going to draw water for a Moabite. But the favor that's shown here is a Moabite woman being offered water from an Israelite man. It's really a profound thing. It's a much bigger deal than when you just kind of read through that. Because Boaz is exhibiting genuine care and kindness for Ruth. In verse 10, then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? Ruth's response is genuine, overwhelming gratitude and humility. It kind of seems over dramatic. I mean, he offers her water and to go pick in the fields, and she falls at his feet, thanking him because she is so grateful. But the kindness that Boaz was showing her was just as dramatic. It was overwhelming care and kindness. She is so grateful to what he is offering. And then verse 11, Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. God is shown here as a rewarder and as a refuge for the faithfulness that Ruth has shown to her mother-in-law and to her mother-in-law's God. And Ruth, her response in verse 13, then she said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants. Ruth again expresses profound appreciation. Because as a foreigner, everything that Boaz was doing for her was undeserving. She had no right to it. Then the story gets even more interesting. Verse 14. And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her and leave it for her to glean. And do not rebuke her. We see here Boaz and Ruth's first date. They show up to eat a feast of barley grain. And it was a feast. Boaz provided so much that she had a takeout box. She had leftovers because she had ate until she was satisfied. And then Boaz, on top of that, continues to show her favor. And not just show her favor, he gives her special privileges. Don't just wait until the harvesters have gone through. You get to go through with them, and you can take some from the bundles. He's showing her profound favor with the privileges that he gives her. Verse 17, so she gleaned in the field until evening. And then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. She gave her the takeout box. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." It says that Ruth had taken in an ephah of barley. We all know what an ephah is, right? Yeah, I didn't either till I read this week. An ephah is basically about a half to 2/3 of a bushel. Now, we've all picked bushels, right? Probably not. That relates to 35 to 50 pounds of grain that she was able to take from gleaning. Now, that sounds like a lot. I imagine that was pretty heavy to carry back from the fields. But here's how much it was. An average field worker would get 1 to 2 pounds of barley a day. In one day, Ruth has taken 20 times a day's wages. Just given to her out of kindness and favor. And then as she comes back, she comes to Naomi, who's been bitter all of this time. Remember, Naomi had lost everything over the course of 10 years. We don't know how long they've been in Bethlehem, but she's still bitter. She sees Ruth come in. And she sees that they have plenty to eat. She begins to show a measure of relief. Blessed be the one. And she asks, whose field was it? And Ruth answers. She told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness is not forsaking the living or the dead." She goes nuts because that's ended with an exclamation point. She is pumped up. Not only do we have food, it's Boaz. Boaz is part of the clan. There's hope in Naomi's voice and her response. Verse 21, and Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, he said to me, you shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest." And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted." So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests. And she lived with her mother-in-law. As the chapter closes, this section of the story, Ruth is still living with Naomi and they have plenty. There is now hope for them. They are well fed. And they have the hope of a Redeemer. What we see in this story is that when you are faithful in loss, God is faithful in his love. When you're faithful, when the world seems to be crashing down on you, God is faithful in his love for you. Ruth had been faithful. She could have stayed in Moab and lived a fairly comfortable life, it seems. She could have went back to her family, probably remarried pretty easily. But she had chosen Naomi and God. She could have went back and done the easy thing, but she chose to love God and to love people. But what we see is choosing God did not fix her problems overnight. Things did not all of a sudden get easy. She didn't just show up in Bethlehem to a welcoming and a feast. She showed up to struggle and scarcity. You see, so often the false hope that we hear coming from churches and pastors is, if you come today and commit your life to the Lord, everything's going to be great for you. You will be healthy. You will be wealthy. You'll have all that you need and all that you want. But that is not what this story tells us. This story tells us that our triumph comes through tragedy. Verse 20 is the linchpin of the whole thing. In verse 20, we see Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." That word kindness, that sounds pretty nice. But that word is profound. Because there's really not an English translation that can encompass what that really means. The Hebrew word that is used there is a word hesed. And yes, it does mean kind, but it means more than just kindness. It means kindness. It means loving. It means merciful. It's extravagant love and kindness. It's not just being nice to someone. It's showing them extravagance. Ruth was a foreigner. Ruth had no right to anything Boaz had. But Boaz showered her with extravagant love and kindness. What a picture of grace that we see. This is a picture of the gospel. As human beings, we are separated from the Lord. Because of our own natures, we are foreigners. We have no right to anything in the kingdom. But God seeks us. God provides for us. He is extravagant in His love and kindness for us. And then Naomi says, Boaz is one of our redeemers. To be a redeemer meant that he had to be a part of the clan. He had to be a part of the family of Elimelech. And as a part of this culture, as a redeemer, he had the right to go and to take all of the property that Elimelech had and to take care and marry his widow. As a redeemer, Ruth and Naomi saw hope. They could be rescued. All of their debts bought and paid for. They would have a home. They would have a family. They would experience extravagant love. Out of all the loss that they had faced, all the tragedy that they had faced, God was being faithful. When you're faithful in loss, God is faithful in love. I don't know about you, but sometimes life is hard. Sometimes life is an uphill battle, a climb, and it never seems like we're getting to the top. I want comforts in life. Do y'all feel me? I like comfort. But sometimes we have to learn how to survive on the crumbs, on the leftovers. Maybe it's the crumbs of hunger, like it was for Ruth and Naomi. But maybe it's the crumbs of financial hardship. Maybe it's loneliness. Maybe it's brokenness. Maybe you or someone you care deeply about has faced or is facing illness. Or maybe there's just turmoil and uncertainty. Elimelech faced that in chapter 1. He was facing uncertainty. He was facing the prospect of his family going hungry. So he pursued hope with an enemy in Moab. Ruth, She chose to be faithful to God. And she chose to love Naomi. She chose to be willing to survive on the leftovers. And her reward was extravagant love and kindness from a Redeemer. When you're faithful in loss, God is faithful in love. Every single one of us. We find ourselves in need of a Redeemer. There is debate from scholars among whose hesed, whose kindness is being talked about here in verse 20. Is it God's kindness or is it Boaz's kindness? I think it's both. I think Boaz is showing us God's kindness through his actions in loving Ruth and Naomi. Boaz is a picture of the hesed, the kindness, the love, the extravagant love that God shows us in Christ. We were all hopeless, without prospect of a future. And God sent a baby. Isaiah 9:6, for to us a child is born. To us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder. And his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, Redeemer. He was here for the brokenhearted. He was here for us who are struggling to live off the crumbs. And in the book of Matthew, he claims this passage in Isaiah 61 for himself. It says, "The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who were bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn." When you're faithful in loss, God is faithful in love. The story of Ruth and Boaz points to the redemption that's available to all of us. Boaz had an opportunity to be the redeemer for Ruth and for Naomi. And it's an incredible story that we'll see even greater things over the next 2 weeks as we finish this. He had the opportunity to be a redeemer, but that's also available to you. All of this, it was fulfilled in the birth of Jesus. It's all available to you if you're faithful, if you trust Him, if you submit to Him.